Russia's 5th gen Su-57 is hot garbage. Putin's so-called 5th generation Su-57 Felon has largely sat on the sidelines during the Ukraine war. I wonder why. Now, officials in Russia are publicly discussing the development of a 6th gen fighter. But this is pure fantasy, designed to whip up nationalist pride in the superiority of Russian weapon systems. Hey friends, Wes here, veteran of the US Army Infantry and the Air Force, where I worked on surveillance radar on the E-3 Sentry AWACS. When Russia first invaded Ukraine, I made a name for myself writing on Medium, where I excelled at talking about Russian military. And I speak Russian, which helps me sift through the propaganda. So what's this about a 6th generation Russian fighter when their 5th generation Felon is actually a 4th generation jet in disguise? Well, let's talk. Earlier this year, Yevgeny Fedosov, scientific director of the State Research Institute of the Aviation Systems, wrote in a column for the state-owned TASS news agency, quote, "Currently, we are thinking about the concept of a 6th generation aircraft, conducting research and exchanging views with military specialists." Fedosov has also started to collect funding for this endeavor. His comment was then echoed on regime-controlled Russian TV and media, where it sparked a nationalistic fervor around Russia's unstoppable superweapons. But Russia has struggled to field its current 4th gen fighters in Ukraine, and certainly hasn't approached anything resembling air superiority. In an article last year, Russian propaganda media outlet Sputnik gushed about the Felon in a piece claiming that the Su-57 edges out the US-made 5th generation F-35. Yeah, sure it does, Sputnik. When we get done with this video, you'll know why that statement is so egregious. The first major hint that all was not as it seemed with the Su-57 came in 2018 when India withdrew from the project to co-develop and produce the aircraft with Russia. Among other concerns, one of the major reasons cited by India was that Russia had not developed a 5th gen engine to power its 5th generation jet. Fun fact, to be classified as true 5th gen, a fighter needs to be able to supercruise without activating the afterburners. Instead, Russia was equipping the Su-57 with versions of the same engine as Russia's 4th generation fighters, the Su-34 fullback and the Su-35, which is actually just a slightly improved derivative of the Su-27 flanker. Well, that's awkward. There were also serious concerns about the Su-57's stealthiness. Because of either a lack of funds or a lack of expertise, the Russians were unable to develop a design that could hide the jet's thermal signature, making it quite unstealthy. When it comes to stealth, not all aircraft are created equal, and the Su-57 is a prime example of how Russia's next-gen fighter might look sleek, but falls short in the radar evading department. Sukhoi claims the Su-57 has a radar cross-section between 0.1 and 1 square meters, which translates to about -10 to 1 decibels relative to square meters in stealth terms. Sounds impressive? Not so fast. For comparison, the F-117 Nighthawk, a relic of 1980s stealth technology, boasts an RCS of around -25 decibels relative to square meters. Meanwhile, the F-22 Raptor and the F-35 Lightning II clock in at a jaw-dropping -40 decibels relative to square meters, or better, especially for the F-22. At least 1,000 to 10,000 times harder to detect than the Su-57. Ouch. Let's talk about radar energy and decibel watts, because who doesn't love a little math mixed with military tech? Decibel watts are a way to measure radar energy, and they work on a logarithmic scale. To find decibel watts, you take the logarithm of the power in watts and multiply by 10. For instance, a radar blasting out 10,000 watts of effective radiated power translates to 40 dBW. Want to crank that up by an extra 10 decibels? You're not just flipping a switch. You'll need 10 times the radiated power. Think more energy, better antenna gain, and narrower beam width. Basically, it's like upgrading from a flashlight to a stadium spotlight. In short, radar tech boils down to a game of numbers, where logarithms make the magic happen, because Why keep math simple when you can complicate it with logarithmic scales? So here's how the math breaks down. An RCS of 0 decibels per square meter is equivalent to 1 square meter of radar reflective area. Basically, the radar sees a target the size of a card table. Crank it up to 10 decibels per square meter, and now the radar is spotting something closer to 10 square meters, like a small bus. Keep going and you'll see how this scale grows exponentially. Now, when it comes to the stealthier side of the spectrum, things get really interesting. A sneaky, low radar cross-section target with an echoing area of just 0.01 square meters, about the size of a frisbee, has an RCS of negative 20 decibels per square meter. Each 10 dB drop represents a 10-fold reduction in radar cross-section. To grasp the real-world implications, let's use Russia's own S-400 Triumph air defense system as a yardstick, which, by the way, is also hot garbage. The system's search radar, according to the manufacturer, can detect a target with a 4 square meter RCS at a range of about 390 kilometers. By that logic, it could spot an F-15 Eagle, 13 square meter RCS, from 523 kilometers away. A Super Hornet, approximately 1 square meter RCS, from 275 kilometers, and the Su-57, assuming an optimistic 0.1 square meter RCS, from 155 kilometers. Meanwhile, the F-22 and the F-35, with their minuscule negative 40 dB RCS, would only be detectable from a paltry 27 kilometers away. In other words, the Su-57 might dazzle at an air show, but on the battlefield, it's like playing hide and seek while wearing a neon vest. For every one time a radar might spot an F-22 or an F-35, it'll catch the Su-57 6 to 10 times. So much for next-gen stealth. The very fact that the Su-57 has largely sat out the Ukraine war shows how little faith the Kremlin has in its performance characteristics. That, and they likely don't want to risk a propaganda loss when one inevitably gets shot down by a Patriot missile. The Felon even made its debut on the silver screen in Top Gun Maverick, where Tom Cruise claimed the Felon was a 5th-generation fighter without identifying the enemy country, and that their 4th-generation FA-18 Hornets and F-14 Tomcats were no match for it. Tom, baby, I love you, but trust me, if the US 4th-gen Hornet went up against Russia's 5th-gen Felon, it would do just fine. Perhaps Russia doesn't understand what makes an aircraft generation. Fighter generations are classified by major technological leaps in historical development of military aircraft. Now, there is no single authority for defining what those leaps must be. Different authorities have identified different tech jumps, but by and large, it roughly looks like this. First generation, the invention of jet engines. This took place toward the end of World War II to the Korean War. Second generation, the widespread adoption of short-range missiles and rockets. This is the first nail in the coffin of traditional dogfighting. With these missiles, it's no longer necessary to rely solely on lining up behind an enemy jet just for a gun kill. These missiles really started showing up during the Korean conflict with the F-5 and the MiG-21. Third generation, the implementation of much better jet engines and beyond visual range missiles. This was a game changer. You could now shoot the bad guys before you could see them, and it didn't matter what aspect they were showing as long as they were above the radar horizon. The early to mid-1960s saw the major rise in the 3rd-gen fighters like the F-4 Phantom, the Mirage 3, and the MiG-23. 4th generation. This is where things get complicated. With 4th gen, 4th plus, and 4.5, there were many iterative improvements during this generation which made these aircraft much more capable and deadly without what I would consider a full tech leap. In the 4th generation, dogfighting progressed with computerized flight controls and fly-by-wire. Pilots no longer had to fight against their own jet at the same time they were fighting against the enemy. The early 1970s marked their introduction, and most of them are still flying today. These include the F-15 Eagle, the FA-18 Hornet, and the MiG-29 Fulcrum. Oh, and the Su-27 Flanker. 5th generation. The United States was the first to make this tech leap with the invention of substantial low observability or stealth materials. This jump was enough for many authorities to call this true 5th generation. Although another characteristic of 5th generation is the ability to perform supersonic cruise flight without switching on the afterburners. These aircraft include the F-22 Raptor, the F-35 Lightning, and supposedly the Su-57 Felon. 6th generation. Technically, and I mean technically, these don't exist yet, but I would consider any fighter that successfully combines stealth with fully autonomous flying as true 6th generation. This is the end of dogfighting. Fully AI-controlled, unmanned fighters will be the next big leap. Now that we know that Russia's 5th gen Su-57 is actually a sheep in wolf's clothing, what would possibly give the Kremlin the idea that they could create and field a 6th generation fighter anytime soon? Granted, Fedosov said his target was 2050 for Russia's next advanced jet, but still, I think that's incredibly optimistic, especially now that we know about the deep corruption within the Russian military apparatus. The Ukrainians have exposed just how dysfunctional the Russian military is at warfighting, not just with equipment and weapon systems, but with fundamental command and control issues and widespread misappropriation of funds for both R&D and maintenance. So I say let Russia waste time and money trying to work out how to field a 6th gen fighter, but don't fall for the propaganda coming out of Moscow or the sensationalist headlines in the media about Russia's next superweapon. Like many things coming out of the Kremlin these days, this is all bark and no bite. Okay, that's it for today. Subscribe if you're not already because it really helps the channel grow. And as always, glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Slava Ukraini.